Good afternoon, or good morning, I guess. I'm Melanie Bloom, Associate Dean of Humanities and Undergraduate Education in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I want to welcome you to the continuation of our year-long virtual seminar series. The goal of this series is to showcase the great work our college faculty, students, and staff do to address some of the critical questions of our time. We initiated this series in September when we featured a discussion called Understanding the Pandemic. That series and the COVID-19 symptom commonly referred to as brain fog led me to start thinking more about not only the unknown effects of this virus on the brain, but what we do and do not know about the brain more broadly. The outstanding panel I've assembled today will help us understand the mind or the brain from several different disciplinary perspectives. Each panelist will present on their work, and we will have time for questions from the audience at the end of each presentation. Feel free to ask a question at any time for any or all panelists using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Kristen Gurton, Assistant Vice Chancellor for the Arts and Humanities and Associate Professor of English. Her research focuses on intersections between literature, philosophy, and science. She seeks to recover hidden histories embedded within the British Enlightenment era given special emphasis to how women and other marginalized populations contributed to such histories. We also have Dr. Joan Caffrey, Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Research Coordinator for Medical Humanities. His research focuses on the intersection between philosophy, cognitive science, neuroscience, and medicine. One of his main areas is what neuroimaging techniques, such as fMRI, tell us about human cognition and the nature of functional localization in the brain. Finally, we have Dr. Ryan Wong, Associate Professor of Biology, who works both in neuroscience and biology. His research aims to identify the molecular and neural mechanisms of stress coping and its influence on learning and memory. In his lab, Ryan uses a variety of techniques commonly used in behavioral neuroscience, behavioral ecology, molecular neuroscience, and transcriptomics. We'll start out today with our presentation from Dr. Girten.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. And Melanie, thank you for organizing us today. And thanks to the College of Arts and Sciences as well. I'm going to just share my screen now because I do have some slides today. Okay, I've decided to call my mini presentation today The Sensitive Witness, and you'll see why. So I'd like to start with just the topic of sensitivity. Asking the question, what is it? Is it a disability or is it a superpower? So when we think about sensitivity, it's typical to think about sensitivity in association with women. So for instance, you might expect the comment, she's so emotional, she's fragile, she's so romantic, she's fickle. Isn't she sweet? We must protect her. She needs a husband to protect her. She's intuitive. She's anxious. She puts her heart above her head. Or the worst of these, is it her time of the month? But of course, men can be sensitive and are sensitive too. Even though they're told boys don't cry, except of course they do. So now I'd like to share with you some details about what is known as the Highly Sensitive Person Scale. And this was first developed in 1997 by Elaine Aron and Arthur Aron. And it includes questions such as, are you easily overwhelmed by such things as bright lights? Do you need to withdraw during busy days? Do you make it a high priority to arrange your life to avoid upsetting or overwhelming situations? Do you notice or enjoy delicate or fine scents, tastes, sounds, or works of art? Do you have a rich and complex inner life? Research into the highly sensitive person is ongoing, and here is just one example of a recent study was published in 2019, and it focuses on children. And it's really interesting that the work on high sensitivity in children is really emerging. And so we're just beginning to do studies that explore high sensitivity in children. And so this is taken from Elaine Aron's website. And as it says here, she wants you to know the following: if you are highly sensitive, or if your child might be, your trait is normal, it is innate. You are more aware than others of subtleties. You are also more easily overwhelmed. This trait is not a new discovery, but it has been misunderstood. Sensitivity is valued differently in different cultures. So one thing I want to be sure to emphasize here is just how common high sensitivity is within our population. The ranges vary depending on who you ask, but according to Elaine Aron, it's about 15 to 20% of us have high sensitivity according to the high sensitivity scale. So again, we might think of it either as a disability, or we can, as we sort of get to know high sensitivity better through the research, we might even transform it into a superpower. Sensitivity increases risk for stress-related problems in response to negative environments, but it also provides greater benefit from positive and supportive experiences. And so if you look again here over to the side, you can see that, that you are more aware, if you are highly sensitive, than others of subtleties. So what other benefits might we discover once we stop treating sensitivity as a disability is, for me, a question this research raises. I am not, however, a psychology professor. I'm an English professor, and my work focuses on 18th century British literature, in fact. And so I would like to tell you now about my current book project, and you'll see from the title that it has connections with this research in sensitivity. My current book project is titled Touching Nature: Sublime Knowledge Making and the Sensitive Witness in British Women's Literature and Philosophy of the Long Enlightenment. And if you aren't aware of that term enlightenment, which is a term that we historians use to refer to, generally speaking, the 18th century, but I take it a long enlightenment. So my book actually goes from 1649 to 1818, with 1818, by the way, being the publication of Frankenstein, which is the final work that my book treats. So I'd like to share with you now some research questions that have come up for me as I've been working on the book. How and why did high sensitivity come to be seen as a weakness rather than a strength? How and why did high sensitivity come to be associated with women? How did women perceive and portray their own sensitivity? And some key discoveries I've made in my research. Influential British women writers and philosophers of the Enlightenment era found ways of using their sensitivity to their advantage, while simultaneously challenging men's attempts to claim superiority by appealing to their masculine insensitivity. So I'd like to unpack that a little bit now for you. So what did high sensitivity in the Enlightenment look like? In fact, in the Enlightenment, there came to be a term that was used to refer to high sensitivity, and that term is sensibility. And you see it here portrayed in this engraving in the figure of a woman. What was sensibility according to Enlightenment thinkers? It was perceived as the affectivity of the nervous system, heightened responsiveness of the mind to external stimuli, and the propensity to strong emotion. So in the Enlightenment, sensibility, or what we now term high sensitivity, was seen as opposed to masculine modesty. And I've already mentioned that even now we still think about sensitivity as associated with women or femininity. And that was certainly the case in the Enlightenment as well. In fact, I argue that the Enlightenment sets an important foundation for that association. And in the period of the Enlightenment, it was, as I say, opposed to what was perceived as masculine modesty. And so for thinking about this term modesty or masculine modesty, we will go back to 1620, in fact, to the founder of our modern scientific method. Some of you may have heard of him. His name is Francis Bacon, and he's most well known for his work, The Novum Organum, or the Great Instauration of 1620. And he really set the stage for our modern scientific method and was extremely influential within the Enlightenment period and really remains so today. So what is the scientific method according to Francis Bacon? And as I share this with you, I would encourage you to think about if you're a student in your science classes, to think about if you use this method or versions of this method in your work today. So according to Bacon, to be a good scientist, you had to purify your mind. You really had to kind of think about the mind as mind and not brain. And what I mean by that is, for Bacon, the idea was to be a good scientist, you had to transcend matter. You had to, in other words, put mind above matter. You had to avoid being affected by what you observe. And so in that's where we get that concept of the modesty, masculine or Baconian modesty. Be modest, don't be affected, don't be, in other words, sensitive. And what this ended up producing, it took a while for the concept of objectivity to really emerge, but you can see how this might have set the stage, as it did, for modern notions of objectivity. According to Bacon and his many followers, to be a scientist or philosopher, one had to be a modest witness. One could not be a sensitive witness. And here's an image of some modest witnesses here. You can see the one on the right giving an exhibit of his scientific experiment. So my book, in contrast, focuses on what I call the sensitive witness. And here I'm showing you all of the major authors that I focus on throughout my book. And I characterize all of them as sensitive witnesses and as, in different respects, and as really promoting the value of sensitive witnessing. For my mini talk today, though, I'd like to focus on the first author I discuss in my book by the name of, her name is Lucy Hutchinson. Lucy Hutchinson translated a very famous, at least became famous in the Enlightenment period, famous work by Lucretius. And this work was actually written in 1st century BCE, but she translated him. And this work is an early theory. It is a poem, but it presents an early theory of the atom. And this theory was inspired by the materialism of the philosopher Epicurus. And in recent years, scholars of the Enlightenment, we've begun to really increase our understanding of just how influential this poem, this Epicurean poem, was in the Enlightenment period. And my book is really aiming to notice how women really engaged with this book. But it's interesting that Lucy Hutchinson was the first translator of this work into English. So we might ask then, as my book does, why would a woman, busy raising her children as she was, translate a long ancient Latin philosophical poem? And in fact, in her preface to her translation, she talks about how her children are running around her as she's sitting at a table, trying to translate this poem. So she was a very busy woman. She did have servants. She was, as you can see from her dress here, she was quite privileged, but she was there surrounded by her children translating this poem. Why would she take on such a task? I argue that this poem helped make the case that masculine modesty is a fiction. Humans are matter and therefore can't transcend matter. It also helped make the case that sensitivity is a strength rather than a weakness. It heightens perception and thus improves rather than weakens scientific or philosophical observations and experiments. And these elements of Lucretius and how Lucretius was perceived by Lucy Hutchinson, these elements are really also important to all of these authors within my book. And they, in different ways, make similar cases. So inspired by Lucretius and Epicurus, these sensitive witnesses of the Enlightenment era really connect mind and brain and see mind and brain and body as intertwined and inseparable. According to the sensitive witness, the best philosophers, scientists are those who feel for and with the objects of their investigation. They recognize the power of touch and the value of empathy. And they perceive that we discover the most when we feel the most, offering really a counter view to Francis Bacon. In fact, for the sensitive witness, the best knowledge is sublime. And you might not be familiar with that term, which is kind of a technical aesthetic term, but let me just tell you a little bit about what that means. If the best knowledge is sublime, according to these sensitive witnesses, that means it is informed by awe and profound emotion. It moves us, it touches us, it penetrates us. To the sensitive witness, in fact, all matter is touching and even sublime. And this is a frontispiece that I've used in an article focused on sensitive witnessing. This is the caption is, I happen to touch one of these called a sensitive plant. And I find this image so fascinating because it's not only the children are touching the plant in their botanical studies, but the plant is essentially touching them back as well. So there's a real intimacy there. So according to this sensitive witnessing, the highly sensitive brain and body are powerful, not weak, for they produce perceptive minds. And I'd like to end my talk today with fast forwarding to the present, actually, to a professor of physics, actually, at the University of New Hampshire. And I recently came across her work. And I'd like to share a quote from her today, Dr. Shonda Prescott-Weinstein. She is, by the way, one of fewer than 100 Black American women to earn a Ph.D. in physics. And as I read this quote, I hope you'll be on the lookout for sensitivity, that concept of the sensitive witness even. My mom once told me people need to know that we live in a universe that is bigger than the bad things that happen to us. When I was in graduate school, still learning the contours of these equations, I was afraid of what might happen if I grew up to be like her. A grassroots organizer whose work focused on poor women, she was fiery and not always well appreciated by people who are afraid of fiery Black women. And she was sensitive, not always surrounded by people who understood that Black women can be both fiery and sensitive. Now I'm old enough to see that I have grown up to be a lot like my mom and that she's where some of my best qualities have come from. I know now that Margaret Prescott has spent her life as a Black girl from the future, pointing us toward the inevitable, essential evolution of our human community into something better. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Dr. Gurton. And so we'll turn things over to Joe McCaffrey. And just a reminder, if you have any questions during the panel, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A.
That was fantastic. I was looking for my applause button and I didn't see one. All right, so going to go ahead and get started here. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Courtney and Melanie, for organizing this wonderful event. And thanks to all of you for attending and to the College of Arts and Sciences. My name is Joan Caffrey. I'm an assistant professor in the philosophy department, and today I'm going to talk to you about one of my central research interests, which is the nature of functional localization in the brain, or how cognitive functions like ability to do math or language abilities or ability to see faces, are those functions related to the very complex structure of the human brain. I didn't have enough time to put the unofficial title on this page, but the unofficial title of my talk is a brain area more like a calculator or a duck boat? And so I'll explain that as I get to the end. So I am, among other things, someone who does the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of cognitive science and neuroscience. And as such, I'm interested in a lot of the big picture questions about the mind that philosophers have been for centuries. I'm interested in the nature of consciousness. What is consciousness? What are different kinds of consciousness? I'm interested in how human beings make moral decisions and how we should make moral decisions. And I tend to think of philosophy as, in a lot of cases, conceptual engineering. So really thinking hard about the assumptions and the concepts that we use in research. And I'm also someone who is deeply appreciative of philosopher Patricia Churchland's idea that in order to understand the mind, things like consciousness, we need to understand the brain. We need to get our hands dirty and see what neuroscientists are doing. And so today I'm going to do a bit of conceptual engineering on a concept in neuroscience. And I'm going to talk about how this concept has changed over time, and also highlight some of the new groundbreaking questions about this concept. And so the concept I'm going to talk about today is the concept of functional localization, which says where in the brain do cognitive functions reside? And a related question is, what do different parts of the cerebral cortex do? So just a little relevant neuroanatomy. The cerebral cortex, the gray and folded thing we look at when we look at brains, is in some sense a uniform 2mm sheet that goes across the whole thing. And it in fact likely has, as we'll talk about, functional divisions, but they aren't obvious from inspecting the thing. And so a question that has pervaded neuroscience throughout history is actually, what do different parts of the cerebral cortex do? I'm going to zoom all the way back to the 1800s, to the 19th century to start, and talk about a debate between the phrenologist Franz Gall and the physiologist Marie Jean-Pierre Flourens about functional localization. So Franz Gall was the innovator of phrenology. You've probably seen the famous phrenological bust. He did studies of people with brain damage, studies of child prodigies, and came up with a list of between 27 and 32 mental faculties that he thought were distinguishable from one another and made up the parts of the mind. And so these faculties were things like a sense of place, a sense of words, a sense of colors, a sense of religion, also moralistic faculties, like a faculty for carnivorous lifestyle and violence, and a faculty for theft and larceny, and things like that. So Gall spelled out his faculties. These are often considered very fanciful now. We'll go into that as we go. So our mental faculties don't really resemble Gall's, except in broad detail. But one thing that was very contemporary about Gall is he insisted that the surface of the cerebral cortex is a set of different organs that each correspond to one of his 27 faculties. And this was called cerebral organology in phrenology. And so Gall was a believer in localization of function. He thought that the faculties of the mind, or the parts of the mind, or the mental functions correspond to individual parts of the brain. At the time, Gall was in a debate with Marie Jean-Pierre Flourens, who criticized this idea. Flourens was doing a number of somewhat grisly experiments, actually. He would take an animal like a pigeon or a rat and section their brain, just starting at the top and shaving off pieces and going on to the bottom. And what Flourens argued is that the animals that he was lesioning in this way didn't lose sight or lose hearing or lose an ability to move, as Gall's theory would predict, but just sort of had all of their functions intact until some amount of brain was lost, and then they would lose them all. And so Flourens argued that functional localization is impossible. He advocated what's sometimes been called holism or equipotentialism, or diffuse action of the cerebral cortex, which is that all the brain is involved in all of the functions. So all the brains involved in seeing, all the brains involved in hearing, etc. Okay, so very shortly after, Paul Broca, who came, just after these figures, identified areas that seem to be very functionally specific, such as the part of the frontal cortex now called Broca's area. And so what Broca did was a careful study of people who had damage to one part of the brain and revealed striking kind of individual deficits. And so, for example, damage to Broca's area causes people to be unable to produce speech, even though they can still comprehend or understand it. Whereas damage to an area discovered by Wernicke causes people to still be able to produce speech, but to lack the ability to comprehend it, right? And so this method of studying lesions to sort of get at functional localization became hugely popular. And so we might say that, because of people like Broca, Gall's localization won, and cerebral organology then continued in some sense unabated into the 1990s and 2000s and even the present. So Gall and Florenz did not have fancy tools like functional MRI, where you scan the brain for what parts are metabolically active or not, but they would have investigated their faculties if they had them. So what started to happen then with tools like fMRI was the discovery of more and more specialized regions. And so as one example, Nancy Canwisher and colleagues at MIT famously found a part of the brain, and what you see here on the left is a contrast between people looking at faces and looking at objects when they're in a scanner, or a contrast between looking at faces versus houses. And here you're seeing a part of the brain that's really active when you look at faces, and then not active when you look at these other objects, right? And so a ton of studies of this sort localized this area, now in the ventral visual stream called the fusiform face area, as a putative module for face processing. And there's been tons of other confirmation of this idea. So you can actually put electrodes on this part of the brain in someone who's about to undergo a surgery and stimulate it and have them look at a face morph into a different face, right? And so then using tools like lesion studies, like Broca and like functional MRI, you get an era of localization of functions to regions, right? And so you have an area for places, an area for objects, an area for faces, an area active when we look at human bodies. That's all in the visual domain. But outside the visual domain, we have other putative functional localizations as well. So the right temporoparietal junction seems to be a part of the brain that's active when we think about what's going on in other people's minds, or theory of mind, when we're thinking about each other's intentions. The amygdala is really famously an area associated with fear, right? And so we get this picture that really resembles Gall's picture, except now we have better functions. So instead of talking about suavity and sense of metaphysics, we talk about 3D objects and processing of theory of mind and social cognition, but the picture is much the same, right? We have the localization of functions to individual regions. And so you can say this is, cerebral organology 2.0. This picture starts to break down in an interesting way, which I will call the network turn, right? And so if you look at these kinds of findings, you might think, oh, well, fear lives in the amygdala. Or, oh, the ability to recognize faces lives in this, fusiform face area, right? Well, it turns out that this is almost entirely untrue. So almost any function that you can think of doesn't map onto one region of the brain, but a whole distributed network. So here in the top left, this is a network involved in recognizing faces. The FFA is part of that, but you need the whole network to be working in order to recognize faces. The same is true for attention. The same is true for autobiographical memory. And the same is true for things like fear. So you have the theory that the amygdala does something fear related, like detecting threats, but it's not where fear lives. Fear lives in a whole distributed network, right? Okay, so now you have maybe a solution, right? So you say, I now can say, the exact extent to which people like Gall versus people like Florenz were right. Brain areas are little cerebral organs that do something simple, but the complex tasks like doing math problems or looking at a face or paying attention are performed by distributed networks. Not the whole brain, like Florenz, but some distributed subset of it. Cool, we are completely done with the question of functional localization. Well, no, it turns out it's more complicated. I'll have to go through this very quickly, but this is what I've been working on in things like a paper that I published in 2015 on the problem of multifunctionality. And I'll try to show how this, what seems like a little problem, becomes very complicated and maybe brings us all the way back to something more radical than what we have now. Okay, so I think the network turn would be an okay solution if the networks were well behaved. And what I mean is something like the picture on the left. So if the brain was organized so that you had a bunch of areas involved in attention, and those are quite distinct from the areas involved in, say, vision, and those are quite distinct from the areas involved in hearing, then this picture can work in a fairly straightforward way, right? So you have regions that contribute something to their domain of cognition or their particular cognitive problem, but then the more complex stuff is done by the network and these things communicate with each other. Well, it turns out that this simple model of how regions might relate to networks of the brain actually completely breaks down, and we have something much more like the picture on the right, where every region is actually recruited for many different functional networks that are involved in many different aspects of cognition. And this is the problem of multifunctionality or neural reuse. And so just to put the problem on the table, people like cognitive scientist Michael Anderson have actually looked at specific regions of cortex and using meta-analyses of fMRI data. So go and looking at hundreds of fMRI studies, you take the area and you say, what has this area been associated with in a bunch of different studies, right? And the answer is, for any cortical area you pick, dozens and dozens and dozens of them, right? And so the picture looks, for Anderson, we wanted a picture like this, where each area does one thing or maybe a couple things, but in fact, we get this picture where every area seems to be involved in different functions and connected with different areas. So just as one example, the anterior insula, which is part of the cortex, it's the site of primary taste. It's the site of the emotion of disgust. It's involved in working memory, your ability to recall numbers for a brief period of time. It's involved in visual attention. It's implicated in addiction. So this is a target if people are suffering from addiction, right? So a whole host of functions that seemingly don't have anything to do with each other, right? In some of my work, I've been interested in how can we understand something like this? So what are the concepts we need to understand this more complex form of localization? I'll go through those just very quickly and then conclude with how crazy this could, in theory, get. So I hope you'll bear with me for a couple more minutes. But I want to say that this is true even of canonical cases of functional localization, like Broca's area, right? So Broca's area was supposed to be an area that just does speech production, right? But if you look at current literature, you see it involved in music cognition and understanding music, visuospatial processing, pattern recognition, the ability to use tools, our knowledge of actions, right? So it's involved in a whole host of other things. So not just true of the insula, but many other areas, in fact, probably all of them. Well, the first strategy I call subdivide and conquer, right? So you might say, well, hey, a cell does a bunch of things, but the cell does different things because it has different parts. So maybe there's no mystery here. You just take the brain area like Broca's and you just chop it up into little parts and hope that each of these parts corresponds with just one function, right? And we have more sophisticated ways to sort of chunk up brains, and some of this seems to be promising. For reasons I'm happy to go into in the Q&A, this isn't a universal solution. So for one, this kind of multifunctionality where one piece of neural tissue seems to be involved in multiple functions is actually a property of even very simple, small brains and nervous systems in animals. So it doesn't seem to go away on a smaller scale. And also, provocatively, you might just eventually run out of brains, right? So we do hundreds and hundreds of thousands of things. And if you think there's really some dedicated millimeter of brain for each one, probably at some point you'll run out of brain before you'll exhaust all the things we do, and you'll be faced with this problem in some form or another. It's not a formal argument, but it's kind of provocative. Okay, so so how do we understand this? Well, one option for understanding it has been an appeal to common workings or computations that the brain area performs. And I liken this to the relationship between a calculator and what you can do with it, right? So think of the insula being involved in taste and disgust, but also cravings and addiction, or think of Broca's being involved in language production, but also pattern recognition and tool use, right? So the proposal here is maybe brain regions perform one function, like a computation that it computes, that lets it be useful for many tasks. So here you can think of a calculator, which just in some sense does one thing, which is crunch numbers, but you could use it to do your taxes, and you could use it to count sheep before you go to bed, right? And so in that case, maybe there's a secret kind of function to be discovered. So that's the proposal. A problem with this is we often don't know how to describe that function, or maybe there is no common function. We should just subdivide it. So just to show you one proposal for how this might work, there's an article by Teta Manti and colleagues that argues that Broca's area is not really about speech at all, but about the ability to compute complex hierarchical structures. And that the thing that grammar shares with the use of tools is that both of them involve having to understand a complex hierarchical tree in which the lower parts are embedded in the higher parts, right? And so according to this view, Broca's doesn't have anything to do with speech per se. It computes hierarchical strings, and that can be useful in lots of different areas of cognition. Okay, but there's a more radical proposal on the table and some evidence that this kind of solution doesn't always work, or that there might not be any common workings or computations to be found. And this is a theoretical frame that the philosophers and cognitive scientists who work on this have called contextualism. And so the idea with contextualism is that possibly parts of the brain can participate in different tasks, but do so through different activities that they have. So they don't straightforwardly divide up, it's one part, but what that one part does in different contexts is actually different. And the mind kind of has to grasp for metaphors here, but I was thinking of something like my colleague Casey O'Callaghan at WashU kind of pitched this example to me, in fact, so I should rep him here, but of a duck boat, right? So a duck boat is an amphibious vehicle that can go and tour the city of Pittsburgh with its wheels. But nonetheless, it can also go in the water and become a boat. And so the interesting thing about the duck boat is that there's not a strict division between the boat parts and the car parts. Like the motor is, involved in both, but nonetheless, it can do different things in different contexts, right? And so just to wrap it up, there's evidence in basic neuroscience that this is sometimes the case. And so there are things like the concept of multiplexing, where the same bit of brain tissue can enact different codes, say firing in a different pattern that encodes a different feature of the environment in different contexts, so that the same part of the brain, for example, can represent something about a representation of objects in space and objects in time, depending on how it's firing. And there are actually lots of examples of this kind of multiplexing in memory research and also in visual research. And so if something like this is true, right, then this idea that every time a region is recruited for different functions, that there's some secret uber function to be discovered might actually be wrong. And brain regions just might do a plurality of things in a plurality of contexts. I want to end by having you think about that idea in a little more detail, which is to say, if what a brain region does at any given moment, its function, depends on what other brain regions are telling it to do, its context, right? So you say you have a network telling this region to do something, this network could tell this region to do a different thing, right? Well, then what's telling that network or those other regions to do something? And in that case, you might say, well, maybe the context in which they are embedded, right? And I think you can maybe start to see how, if this contextualist solution is true, we might be back to something more resembling holism, right? So if the function of anything is dependent on what the whole rest is doing at a given time, we might have gone all the way back to Florenz, who might have the last laugh for all we know. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. McCaffrey. Okay, we'll move on to Dr. Wong.
All right, great. Thanks. And so I would like to thank Melanie and Courtney again for organizing this really nice seminars here. And so today, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be trying to think a little bit about what it could be like to put ourselves in the minds of other animals. And more specifically, I'm going to be talking to you about the link between the brain, genetics, personality, as well as cognition. And when I say cognition, I'm really thinking about the context of learning and memory. So to get us started here, what I'd like you to do is think back over the past, let's say weeks, months, or years to a particular event or scenario that may have led you to be anxious. Okay. And so as you're thinking about these particular moments, you might have come across, let's say, an idea of, let's say, if you're on a roller coaster, or maybe if you were trying to prepare for a public talk, or maybe even preparing for an interview. Okay? So regardless of which type of event or moment that you're thinking about that led you to be anxious here, do you also remember how you felt at the time? Right? So the idea being that maybe if you didn't know what the outcome was going to be, right? So you weren't sure what was going to result at the end. What could have happened is that you may have began to breathe a little bit quicker, your heart may have beaten a little bit faster, you may even have started to sweat a little bit. And so in other words, you had a slight stress response. And so with all this in mind here, now what we can ask is, if we can go through these types of anxiety or anxious types of moments, can animals also experience the same type of responses? And so to be able to answer this question a little bit more directly here, it's going to be important for us to see if there are particular moments that we can think about that causes us to be anxious. And then is there going to be an equivalent type of moment or equivalent type of scenario that these animals can also experience in their daily lives? And so let's go through an example, right? So let's say you want to go ahead and get some water at your local grocery store. And so if you're going to the grocery store and then you see this aisle where all the water is cleared out, right? And so you might be a little bit anxious because now you're not sure how you're going to get water. Well, now if we're thinking about a potential similar scenario in animals, we can think about it in, let's say, in terms of seasonality. So let's say, for example, during the springtime, food and water might be really plentiful. But now, let's say several months later, during the winter season, these same animals in the same spot may not have as easy access to food and water. And so in other words, they're going to be a little bit more uncertain on where they can get food and water. Another example that might be relatable for all of us is that if there's a potential danger in the area, right? And so if there's potential danger in the area, all of us here are going to be a little bit uncertain because we're not quite sure if the danger is going to harm us or if it's going to pass on by. Now, thinking about it from the daily lives of an animal, it can also occur in a similar scenario. So in this case here, it might be the presence of a predator, right? So if a predator entered into the area, animals might be a little bit uncertain and let's say take up a defensive type of behaviors, but either way, they're not quite sure if that predator is going to attack or it's going to pass on by. But the point here, what I'm trying to get across is that some of the moments that we experience in our own lives that can lead us to feel anxious can be very similar to moments or scenarios in the daily lives of animals as well. So thinking back about the example that you had in your mind about this anxious moment and thinking back about sort of what was going on, I'd also like you to think back about how you actually overcame that anxious or stressful moment. And not only thinking about how you overcame that anxious or stressful moment, you can also think about what if your friend or your family member was exposed to that same type of anxious event, right? So we can ask this question, would your friend or family respond in the same way that you do to this type of anxious moment? And likely the answer is going to be no, right? So likely what's going to happen is that you will respond in one particular way and your family member or your friend will respond in a different way. So one of the things that is different amongst all of us is going to be our personalities. And so another way to think about this here is that perhaps these personalities or what happens is that personalities might be able to influence how we behave or respond to a particular stressor or particular anxious moments. Not only in that particular moment, but can also help us explain what happens across different contexts as well as different times. And so here I just show you a cartoon from Gary Larson to help illustrate this idea of people responding in different ways to the same event. So we've got your cup of water that's on the table here, and then some people will say it's half empty, some people will say it's half full, other people will have completely different responses. Okay, and so what has happened in more recent times is that we were able to now be able to find nuances and categorizations or identifications of specific personality types. And so one example of this here is the Myers-Briggs personality types here, listed here on the right. And for those of you who are like me, that like to take sort of online personality quizzes or maybe have to do something similar for your work, perhaps one of these personality types or these types of letters that are represented here is going to be sort of result of your quiz or result of your work activity. But the thing what I wanted to point out here is that if you're thinking about personality, it falls on a spectrum. So for example, on one end of the spectrum, a person might be an extrovert, and on the other end of the spectrum, a different person might be an introvert. right? So you might be on one end or the other, or you actually might be somewhere in the middle. So just like us humans, animals can also have personalities. But if we're going to try and apply or use the sort of nuanced personalities or nuanced categorizations of personalities that have been really well described within the human personality and human psychology literature, it's going to be a little bit difficult to apply those in animals. But if we look at some of the core elements or core features of the definition of a personality and broaden it out a little bit here, we will actually be able to apply these personalities or this definition to identify personalities in animals. And so when I say these core features or core elements here, I'm really thinking about, let's say, the behavioral responses and the associated bodily responses or bodily functions that are linked together across context as well as time. So if we look at this definition in that way, we can identify sort of two personality types that have been seen and observed across many different animal species, including us. And so these here are your shy and bold personalities. Right? And I'm sure that if you're thinking about a person who is shy or a person who is bold, you have a sort of an idea of how that person might behave in different scenarios. Okay, and so for example, let's say if you have a big open space, a person who is shy or an animal who is shy will actually not take as many risky behaviors, right? So they'll be risk adverse and they'll have a higher stress response. Now, on the other hand, if we're talking about an individual who is bold, right, whether it's a human or an animal, and put them in the exact same scenario, this individual will actually be taking more risky behaviors, right? So for example, they might be moving a lot more often or exploring more often, and they'll have a lower stress response. And so I just put a couple of movie characters on here to help exemplify this idea of shy and bold personalities that are there. But as I mentioned, we can identify these easily here in human animals, but if we also look at other animal species, they're also present. So there have been multiple studies documenting shy and bold personalities in other mammals, such as rodents and pigs. And we can also see them in various species of birds, reptiles, and also lots of different species of fishes as well. Okay, so now when we're thinking about our response, both our behavioral response as well as our physiological or bodily responses to that anxious or stressful moment, and sort of the behavior that resulted from it, what that is a product of, it's a product of integration or combination of information from both the external and internal environments. And so, for example, let's say if we go ahead and look out the window today and we see what the weather is outside. So whether it's a nice day or a stormy day, it helps us decide what clothes to wear. Similar idea, if we take a look at the faces of other people, it allows us to find out how we want to approach that particular person. And so just as we take in information about our ecological or social environment, animals will also do the same thing, right? So whether we're talking about rodents, honeybees, birds, or fishes, they take in information about their ecological and social environment. And then as they integrate all of this information or combine all this information, they produce ultimately a behavioral response or a bodily response. And so this behavioral or bodily response is going to be due to a combination of factors. So it's going to be due to some activity within regions of the brain. And not only does that involve regions of the brains, but it's also going to be dictated by what is encoded in their genome. And so what really fascinates myself, as well as members of my lab, is trying to answer this question of what are the causes and consequences of a particular personality type. And so what I mean by this here is that if we're looking at behaviors, if we know an individual's personality type, can we predict how they might behave in other contexts, as well as what is the role of genetics, as well as the brain in these personalities? Okay. And so I answer, or we investigate these types of questions or these types of themes using zebrafish. Okay. And so zebrafish are actually a small freshwater species of fish. When I say small, they're about 2 inches in length. And as you can see from the image here on the left, they get their name because some species have actually a striped pattern that sort of resembles zebras. Okay. But what has been really a really nice tool, a really nice advantage of using zebrafish is that many scientists have also developed really sophisticated tools to be able to measure and alter their behaviors, neural activity within their nervous system, as well as the gene amount or gene expression. And so just to give you some examples of this here is that there are, for example, automated software that allows us to track where zebrafish are moving. And then if you are familiar with glowfish, so you might have been able to see this in your local pet store, these glowfish are actually just genetically modified zebrafish, that were modified such that they have a fluorescent protein inserted in their genome. And so when you shine a black light on them, they will appear to fluoresce a particular color. Okay, and so now that you know that I am interested in looking at, let's say, personalities and also working on this in fish, one question you're probably asking is, what does it mean to actually have a personality in fish? And so to explain this a little bit differently here, let's go through a thought exercise. All right, so one exercise here is we can have one individual that is like a fish that is shy and another fish that is going to be bold. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to expose them to 3 different contexts or 3 different scenarios. So one scenario could be, let's say, in the presence of a threat or a predator. Another one is they're exploring a new area in their home. And another scenario could be, let's say, if it's nighttime and then all of a sudden they shine a flashlight in their water, and then we have a spotlight of light showing up there. Right? And so now that you know that, let's say, an individual fish is going to be shy, I'm pretty sure you can predict how these animals might behave in each of these contexts. So for example, a shy fish would be less adventurous, they wouldn't explore as much, and they might try to avoid that spotlight. So in other words, they spend more time in the dark areas. On the other hand, if we're thinking about an individual fish that is bold, they would behave in the exact opposite way. Right? So they'll be more adventurous, higher exploratory activity, and may even venture into the spotlight. But one of the points that I'm trying to drive across here is that by knowing an individual's personality type, we could reliably predict how that individual might behave across different contexts. Or another way to put this is that these behaviors could be linked across contexts. Okay? And so with this idea that behaviors can be linked across contexts, in other words, if we know an individual's personality type, we can predict how they might behave across these different scenarios or different contexts here. One thing that also interests me is that knowing that we have different context sets here, what's happening from the animal's perspective is that they are processing information in their brains, and not only they're processing different types of information, but they're also encoding or remembering or storing that information in their brain for later use. And so what also interests me is trying to understand how does an individual's personality influence or change or alter or modulate other domains. And so for this other domain here is I'm really interested in trying to understand how personality influences these cognitive domains such as learning and memory capabilities. All right, and so now you're probably asking, okay, sir, we're looking at fish, right? And we're looking at personality. Now you're talking about sort of learning and memory. So question comes up is, how do you actually teach a fish, right? So what can you actually do to this? Well, for those of you who have pets at home, so let's say, for example, if you have a pet dog, many of the conceptual basis of how you train a dog or teach a dog certain types of behaviors or tricks can actually be similarly applied for fish, right? And so it's going to be through some sort of conditioning. And so what I can do here is I can just show you just a couple of just common examples here. And so one example would be, let's say, if you want to, if a fish is ready for food, it should actually swim over a particular area. And so this would be analogous to, let's say, if you're trying to teach your dog to roll over, right? So if once the dog rolls over, then you would sort of reward it with a treat. And so the similar idea here, if the fish performs a particular behavior, and this is what you're desiring, you can administer a food reward or a treat that's there. Similar idea, let's now say if every time you feed your fish is after you turn on the light. So then what happens now is the fish is going to learn that when the light is turned on, it's time to go eat. Okay. And so regardless of the conditioning method here, what's happening is that they're trying to learn associations. And so these learned associations can either be through positive or negative reinforcements that are there. All right, so with this in mind here, now let's go back and more directly look at differences in personality and its potential impact on learning and memory capabilities. And so one study that was published by a former graduate student of mine, Matthew Baker here, he wanted to look at these differences in personality, see if it impacts learning and memory. So what he did is he trained individual shy and bold fish to associate a white box with a potential threat or potential danger that could be around. And so after several training trials, what he then also wanted to ask is, now how long do these fish remember that this white box is going to be signaling a potential threat or danger is near? And so if you're interested in the data I show you here on the right, but the big take-home message you can have here is that shy fish appear to have a faster learning or fear learning rate. And not only are they able to learn this training paradigm a little bit quicker, but they also seem to remember it a little bit longer, at least relative to the bold fish. And so another way we can put this here is that it seems like personality types can impact learning and memory capabilities. And so this leads us to have really interesting questions, such as trying to understand what are the causes behind these differences here. Right? So perhaps maybe these shy fish could actually find this scenario here a little bit more threatening than the bold. Right? And so people in my lab are interested in sort of two broad behavioral themes. One theme is trying to understand how animals overcome with stress. And another set of people in my lab are interested in this idea of learning and memory capabilities in our zebrafish. We tied this together by trying to understand what is the impact of an animal's personality type in their response to overcoming these different types of stress, as well as learning and memory capabilities. We're also really interested in trying to understand the role of the brain, as well as the genetics in variation or in producing these different types of responses. And so some of the big questions that we're trying to ask here are what parts are going to be important. So for example, are there particular brain regions or particular genes, right? Or particular networks that are going to be there. In addition to looking at what are the important parts, we can also try to understand, we're also interested in trying to understand, are there unique features that, let's say, it's unique networks of brain regions or genes that help to facilitate the expression of one behavior over another behavior within the context of an animal's personality. And so with that, I'd like to thank everyone here for listening, and the potential to have some answers for some of these questions wouldn't be possible without funding from the NIH and NSF, and they definitely wouldn't be possible without the hard work and talented members of my lab, so ranging from graduate students as well as undergraduates. All right, and thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have as well.
Thank you to all of our panelists. We just have a couple minutes left here for questions. And so we do have a question that's kind of broad that I think maybe any one of you could answer. But what would you say are the most exciting frontiers for research in your area on the brain or the mind in each of your fields?
I might just step into that silence and say, Joe, I was excited to hear you mention the theory of mind. That has actually been a really exciting area of research in literary studies in recent years. And that's a real growth area of thinking about cognitive science in relation to literary analysis. And I would also say I have a friend who has done work on reading Jane Austen and doing fMRI scans while reading, or at least after reading. And so that's also really been really interesting, is thinking about localization as it relates to our responses to the reading of fiction. So the kind of work that I personally think that the most exciting work in the field of literary study tends to be currently transdisciplinary. And the more kind of collaborations and partnerships we can have across disciplines, I think the more we'll learn. So just a little plug for that as well, which is a way also of celebrating our session today too.
And I will sort of chime in as well is, I think one of the really exciting areas that is moving forward over the next, let's say, 10, 20 years is, and then I think Joe brought it up a little bit in his presentation, is now if we're looking at any type of, let's say, behavior or physiological response, can we understand what are the more precise either neural, biological, or genetic mechanisms that are underlying that. And just as Joe was highlighting there, I don't think that all of them will be, let's say, one brain region or one gene, or the idea of functional localization, or vice versa, where it's going to be sort of entirely holistic. I think that there's going to be a great opportunity to look at sort of the sort of midway point between the two. And so I think likely what's going to happen is that there's going to be some units where there's going to be more of this network or this holistic idea that gives us insight. But if we're looking at individual genes or brain regions, they'll also be important. And after identifying this, I think what would also be really cool to see is how once we know sort of the substrate involved, is there a way to engineer that? And in other words, if we know the parts, but if we know what those parts are, how can we then figure out how those parts work together to produce the behaviors? Because I think as Joe was mentioning there, it might really depend on what context that's there. And so if there's a different context, you might have similar parts, but how they're interacting, we'll have to also figure out how those interacting parts will come together in different contexts.
Yeah, I wanted to mention a theme that came up in both Dr. Wong and Dr. Gurton's presentation, which is that, Gall's faculties included like aspects of personality and moral type traits, right? So, but neuroscience, I think, and cognitive science for a long time didn't really have, it had great tools to think about language and what the parts and processes are, but actually not great theoretical tools for thinking about what personality traits really are or how they could be realized by parts of the brain. And I think that, the way there's a similarity in the way that, Dr. Gurton's talk was talking about sensitivity, right? And the way that Dr. Wong's talk was talking about being bold or shy. And so one thing I think is a really cool horizon, and you see this in fields like moral psychology, in philosophy, and also in, psychiatry and translational neuroscience, is that I think some of these new ways of thinking about the mind and behavior as kind of emerging from this constellation of different areas working together is providing some way to talk about personality, some way to talk about individual differences, and some way to talk about moral aspects. So, Dr. Soonjo Huang over at UNMC is interested in things like what is the brain basis of children who are have violent tendencies and are kind of difficult to kind of have normal sort of moral development, right? And I think we're to a point where we can start posing those kinds of questions in a more meaningful way without just doing what Gall did and saying that there's a blob for wisdom or for love of your offspring or something like that. So that's a horizon I think is cool.
I think that's a great thought to conclude on, and I want to be mindful of the time because we are running over a little bit. So I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing your research with us today. And I did want to mention that our next seminar will be held at noon on Wednesday, March 24th, and we'll focus on scholarship on the Great Plains. So for more information about this and other programs in the College of Arts and Sciences, please visit our website. And I want to thank you all for attending. And I see that Courtney's put in the chat a link to next month's panel. So thanks to all our panelists and thanks to you for attending.